The stagecoach rattled into Yuma, Arizona, through a landscape so parched it looked like God himself had forgotten this corner of creation. And Victoria Ramsey pressed her gloved hand against the window, wondering if she had made the greatest mistake of her life. Dust coated everything in sight, transforming the world into varying shades of brown and beige, and the July heat of 1878 pressed down like a physical weight even through the wooden walls of the coach. She had traveled 2,000 miles from Philadelphia to marry a man she had never met, answering an advertisement that promised a good life on a working ranch. And now, as she watched the desperate faces of the townspeople moving slowly through streets that seemed to shimmer with heat, she felt her stomach clench with uncertainty. The other passenger, an elderly woman who had boarded in Tucson, leaned forward and patted Victoria's knee with a weathered hand. "Do not let the drought frighten you, dear. This land has been through worse, and it always comes back. Always." Victoria managed a smile, though it felt brittle on her lips. At 23, she had thought herself ready for adventure, ready to escape the suffocating expectations of her family and the endless parade of unsuitable suitors her mother insisted on inviting to dinner. Her father, a banker who had lost everything in the panic of '73, had been quietly relieved when she announced her intention to travel west as a mail-order bride. One less mouth to feed, one less dowry to scrape together. Her younger sisters had wept at her departure, but Victoria had felt something close to relief as the train carried her away from everything familiar. Now, staring at the sun-bleached buildings and the dried riverbed visible in the distance, she wondered if relief had been premature. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of a weathered building with a sign that read, "Yuma Station," and the driver climbed down with movements that spoke of exhaustion. Victoria gathered her small carpet bag and the larger trunk that contained everything she owned in the world, including her mother's wedding dress carefully wrapped in tissue paper. The fabric would be far too heavy for this climate, she realized with a pang, but she had brought it anyway, a talisman of sorts. Stepping down from the coach, the heat hit her like a physical blow. Philadelphia had been warm when she left, but this was something else entirely, a dry furnace that seemed to steal the moisture from her lungs with every breath. Her traveling dress, already wrinkled and dusty from the journey, clung to her back with sweat within moments. "Miss Ramsey." She turned at the sound of her name and found herself looking at a man who seemed carved from the same hard landscape that surrounded them. He stood perhaps 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad from years of physical labor and skin tanned to the color of saddle leather. His face was all angles and planes, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of stubble and eyes the color of sage that studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Dark hair showed beneath his worn hat, and dust covered his clothes as thoroughly as it covered everything else in this God-forsaken town. "Yes," she managed, her voice sounding thin and Eastern to her own ears. "You must be Mr. Harrison." "Caleb Harrison," he confirmed, and his voice was deep and rough, like gravel tumbling in a river. He did not smile, but something in his eyes softened slightly as he took in her appearance. "Welcome to Yuma. I hope the journey was not too difficult." "It was long," Victoria said honestly, "but I survived it well enough." Caleb nodded and moved to collect her trunk, lifting it with an ease that spoke of considerable strength. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, carved by years of squinting into the sun, and the tension in his jaw that suggested he was carrying burdens heavier than any trunk. He was older than she had expected, perhaps 30 or 31, and there was a weariness about him that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "The ranch is about an hour's ride from here," he said, securing her trunk to the back of a wagon that had seen better days. The horse hitched to it was thin, ribs visible beneath its hide, and Victoria felt a fresh wave of concern wash over her. "We should get moving before the heat gets worse." Victoria wanted to ask how the heat could possibly get worse, but she bit her tongue and allowed Caleb to help her onto the wagon seat. His hands were calloused and rough against her own, and she found herself acutely aware of his proximity as he climbed up beside her. He smelled of dust and sweat and something else, something earthy and not entirely unpleasant. They rode in silence for the first few miles, and Victoria used the time to study the landscape around them. The Gila River, which should have been flowing strong this time of year according to the letters Caleb had sent, was reduced to a series of muddy pools connected by damp sand. The vegetation was sparse and brown, and every living thing seemed to be merely enduring, waiting for relief that showed no sign of coming. "How long has it been since it rained?" she finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. Caleb's jaw tightened. 14 months. "We had a bit of moisture last spring, but not enough to make a difference. The ranchers are selling off their herds because there is not enough water or grass to sustain them. Some families have already packed up and left. But you stayed." "This is my land," he said simply, and there was steel beneath the words. "My father bought it in 1865 when he came back from the war. He built the house with his own hands, dug the well, raised cattle that were the envy of the territory. He died 3 years ago, and I will be damned if I let the land die with him." Victoria heard the pain beneath the determination and found herself respecting this hard man beside her. "I am sorry for your loss." Caleb glanced at her, surprise flickering across his features. "Thank you. I suppose I should apologize for the timing of your arrival. I wrote those letters 6 months ago, before I knew how bad things would get. If you want to turn around and go back east, I would understand." "No," Victoria said, and was surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "I did not come all this way just to turn back at the first sign of difficulty. Besides, I imagine you could use the help." For the first time, something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of Caleb's mouth. "I imagine I could at that." The Harrison Ranch, when they finally reached it, was both better and worse than Victoria had expected. The house itself was solidly built, a low structure of adobe and wood with a covered porch that would provide blessed shade. A windmill stood nearby, its blades turning lazily in the hot breeze, and several outbuildings suggested this had once been a prosperous operation. But everything was coated in dust, and the corral contained only 3 horses, all of them as thin as the one pulling their wagon. What should have been green pastures were expanses of cracked earth and dead grass, and the vegetable garden near the house was a collection of withered plants gasping for survival. Caleb helped Victoria down from the wagon and carried her trunk into the house. The interior was dim and blessedly cooler than the outside air, though still warm by Eastern standards. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a rough wooden table surrounded by mismatched chairs in the center. Everything was neat but worn, cared for but clearly the domain of a man living alone. "Your room is through here," Caleb said, leading her to a small bedroom off the main space. It contained a bed covered with a faded quilt, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a wooden chair beneath a window that looked out toward the distant mountains. "It was my mother's sewing room before she passed. I hope it will suit." "It is fine," Victoria assured him, touched by the obvious effort he had made to prepare the space for her. A vase containing a few wilted wildflowers sat on the dresser, and the floor had been recently swept. Thank you. Caleb nodded and retreated to the doorway, where he stood as if uncertain what to do next. I should let you rest and freshen up. We can talk about arrangements later. The wedding, I mean. I wrote to the minister in town, but with things being as they are, I thought perhaps you would want some time to settle in first. Victoria set her carpetbag on the bed and turned to face him fully. Mr. Harrison, I appreciate your consideration, but I think we should speak plainly with one another. We are both adults, and this is a business arrangement as much as anything else. You need help with your ranch and someone to keep your house. I need a home and a fresh start. I suggest we marry within the week, once I have had time to make myself presentable and learn my way around. Caleb studied her for a long moment, and Victoria had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing far more than she intended to reveal. You are not what I expected, Miss Ramsey. What did you expect? Someone softer. Someone who would cry at the sight of this place. I might have cried if I had the moisture to spare, Victoria said with a wry smile. But I think we need all the water we can get, so I shall save my tears for when the rains come. This time Caleb did smile, a real smile that transformed his face from harsh to handsome in an instant. Then we shall marry on Saturday if that suits you. It will give you time to write to your family and prepare yourself. Saturday suits me perfectly. After Caleb left her alone, Victoria sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself a moment of doubt. The room smelled of dust and dried lavender, and through the window she could see nothing but brown earth stretching toward the horizon. She had imagined many things during her long journey west, but the reality was both harder and somehow more honest than her fantasies. Caleb Harrison was not the romantic figure she had conjured in her mind during sleepless nights on the train, but there was something solid and real about him that was strangely comforting. She unpacked her few belongings, shaking out dresses and hanging them in the small closet. Everything would need to be washed, but that would have to wait until she understood the water situation here. If they were in the midst of a drought, every drop would be precious. When she emerged from her room an hour later, having changed into a lighter dress and pinned her dark hair into a more practical style, she found Caleb standing at the stove attempting to boil coffee. The pot was rattling ominously, and the smell suggested the coffee had been sitting far too long. "Let me," Victoria said, moving to take over before he could protest. She poured out the bitter brew and rinsed the pot with a minimum of water from the bucket by the sink, then measured out fresh grounds with a practiced hand. "Where do you keep your supplies?" Caleb pointed to a pantry, and Victoria spent the next few minutes taking stock. The shelves were sparsely populated with the staples of bachelor existence: flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, coffee, and little else. No preserved vegetables, no butter, no eggs. She would need to remedy that, drought or no drought. "You have chickens?" she asked. "Had to sell them when the grain got too expensive to buy," Caleb admitted, leaning against the doorframe and watching her work. "Sold most of the cattle, too. Kept 20 head that I am hoping will make it through to the rains whenever they come. And the vegetable garden, doing my best, but I am no gardener. Most everything has died." Victoria nodded, already making mental lists. "Tomorrow I shall see what can be salvaged. Tonight, however, you will have a proper meal even if I have to work miracles with salt pork and beans." She did manage something approximating a proper meal, though it took every skill her mother had taught her. The beans, soaked and cooked with onions she found hanging in the pantry, were at least edible. She made cornbread in a cast iron skillet, the only pan she could find that was not dented beyond use, and served everything with the fresh coffee that at least smelled like civilization. Caleb ate with the focused intensity of a man who had been surviving rather than dining, and Victoria felt a small surge of satisfaction when he went back for seconds. They ate in silence at first, the scrape of spoons against tin plates the only sound, but gradually, Caleb began to talk. He told her about the ranch, about the good years when the cattle had been fat and the grass had grown tall enough to wave in the breeze. He told her about his father, a Union veteran who had come west to escape the memories of war and had built something beautiful in this harsh land. He told her about the first year after his father's death, when Caleb had thought he could manage everything alone, and the slow realization that loneliness was as much an enemy as drought. "I am not good at pretty words," he said finally, pushing his empty plate away and meeting her eyes across the table. "I cannot promise you an easy life or a romantic one, but I can promise you honesty, respect, and the best I have to give. That is all I have to offer." Victoria folded her hands in her lap, feeling the calluses she had earned doing work her mother considered beneath their station, work she had done in secret to help her family after her father's ruin. "I do not need pretty words, Mr. Harrison. I need purpose and partnership. I need to know that my contributions matter, and that I am valued for more than my ability to smile and pour tea. Can you promise me that?" "Yes," Caleb said without hesitation. "I can promise you that. Then we have an agreement." The week that followed was one of the strangest of Victoria's life. She woke each morning before dawn to help Caleb with the morning chores, learning to pump water from the precious well and distribute it to the livestock, with the careful precision of a miser counting gold. Every drop mattered, and she quickly learned to wash dishes with a bare minimum of moisture and to save the gray water for the desperate garden plants. Caleb proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to care for the horses and the few cattle that remained. The animals were suffering, their eyes dull with hunger, despite Caleb's best efforts to find them feed, and Victoria felt her heart breaking for them. She had never considered herself particularly sentimental about livestock, but there was something deeply wrong about watching creatures suffer through no fault of their own. In the afternoons, when the heat became truly unbearable, they retreated to the house where Victoria worked on making the space more livable. She found curtains in a trunk and hung them to keep out the worst of the sun. She scrubbed floors and beat rugs and organized the chaos of bachelor living into something resembling order. Caleb watched these transformations with bemused appreciation, clearly unused to having his space altered, but not objecting. In the evenings, after a simple supper, they sat on the porch and talked. These conversations were Victoria's favorite part of the day, as the terrible heat finally began to fade, and the sky turned colors she had never seen in Philadelphia. Caleb spoke little about his own feelings, but he was curious about her life back east, asking questions that showed he was genuinely listening to her answers. She told him about her father's downfall, about the whispers and the shame, and the way their friends had melted away when the money disappeared. She told him about her mother's desperate attempts to maintain appearances and her sister's fears about their own futures. She even told him about Marcus Whitmore, the man her mother had wanted her to marry, a wealthy banker's son with wandering hands and a cruel smile. "You deserve better than that," Caleb said quietly when she finished the story. "I know," Victoria replied. "That is why I am here." On Friday evening, the day before their wedding, Caleb rode into town and returned with a small package wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to Victoria with an awkwardness that she was beginning to find endearing. "For tomorrow," he said gruffly. "I know it is not much, but I wanted you to have something." Victoria unwrapped the package to find a length of cream-colored lace, delicate and beautiful, clearly intended for a veil. Her throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "Caleb, this is lovely. You did not have to do this." "I wanted to," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her believe him. "You are giving up a lot to be here. The least I can do is try to make our wedding day special." That night, Victoria lay awake in her narrow bed and listened to the wind howling across the empty land. Tomorrow she would marry a man she barely knew, tying her fate to his in ways she could not fully predict. She should have been terrified, but instead she felt a strange sense of rightness, as if all the roads of her life had been leading to this dusty ranch in the middle of nowhere. The wedding itself was a simple affair, held in the small church in Yuma with only a handful of witnesses. Victoria wore her best dress, a blue cotton that she had carefully washed and pressed, with the lace veil Caleb had given her arranged over her dark hair. Caleb wore clean clothes and had shaved for the occasion, revealing the strong lines of his face without the softening effect of stubble. The minister, Reverend Thompson, was an elderly man with kind eyes who spoke the familiar words of the marriage ceremony with genuine warmth. When Caleb slipped a simple gold band onto Victoria's finger, his hands were steady, and when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, his kiss was brief but not perfunctory. They emerged from the church into blinding sunshine to find a small group of townspeople waiting with shy congratulations. A rancher named Tom Peters shook Caleb's hand and wished them well. A shopkeeper's wife named Mrs. Chen gave Victoria a small basket containing eggs and a precious jar of honey. These small kindnesses, offered by people who clearly had little to spare, moved Victoria more than any grand gesture could have. The ride back to the ranch felt different somehow, charged with new significance. Victoria was now Mrs. Harrison, bound to this land and this man through vows that felt more solid than any contract. She glanced at Caleb and found him looking at her, something warm and uncertain in his eyes. "Are you frightened?" he asked quietly. "A little," Victoria admitted. "Are you?" "Terrified," he said with a slight smile. "I have not shared my life with anyone since my father died. I am not sure I remember how. Then we shall learn together." That night, their wedding night, was awkward and tender by turns. Caleb was gentle with her, mindful of her inexperience, and if the physical joining was not the passionate romance of novels, it was at least honest and real. Afterward, lying in the darkness of what was now their shared room, Caleb pulled her close and pressed his face into her hair. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what? For coming here. For staying. For being you." Victoria closed her eyes and let herself relax into his embrace, feeling safe in a way she had not felt in years. Outside, the wind continued its endless howling, but here in this room, in this bed, she had found a kind of shelter she had not known she was seeking. The weeks that followed established a rhythm to their days. Victoria threw herself into the work of maintaining the household and caring for the animals with a determination that clearly surprised Caleb. She was not afraid of hard work, and she discovered a deep satisfaction in seeing the results of her efforts. The house became cleaner and more organized. The garden, with careful tending and precious water, began to show signs of life. She even managed to talk Caleb into buying a few chickens from a family that was leaving the territory, reasoning that the eggs would more than pay for the grain they would need. Caleb, for his part, seemed to soften around the edges as the days passed. He smiled more readily, talked more freely, and began to rely on Victoria not just for domestic help but for genuine partnership. They made decisions together about the ranch, about which cattle to keep and which to sell, about how to stretch their dwindling resources through what was shaping up to be another rainless winter. But the drought continued, relentless and cruel. August brought temperatures that made July seem mild by comparison, and September offered no relief. The well level dropped steadily, and Caleb began to ration water even more strictly, cutting back on everything except the barest necessities for drinking and cooking. The cattle continued to suffer, their bellies hollow and their movements lethargic, and Victoria could see the worry eating away at her husband. One evening in early October, as they sat on the porch watching another spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Caleb finally spoke the words Victoria had known were coming. "We are not going to make it through the winter if something does not change," he said, his voice flat with exhaustion. "The well is running dry and I cannot afford to buy feed for the cattle. I have been thinking about what we should do." Victoria's heart sank, but she kept her voice steady. "What are you considering?" "Selling the remaining cattle and moving to California. I could find work there, maybe on someone else's ranch or in the mines. We would have enough money to start over somewhere with water." "Is that what you want?" Victoria asked quietly. Caleb was silent for a long moment. "No," he finally said. "This land is in my blood. My father gave his life to building this place, and I feel like I would be betraying him if I gave up. But I will not ask you to stay and watch everything fall apart. You did not sign up for that." Victoria reached over and took his hand, feeling the roughness of his calluses against her palm. "Caleb Harrison, I signed up for exactly this. For better or worse, remember, I am not leaving and neither are you. We will find a way." "How?" The word was almost a plea. "I have tried everything. I have prayed for rain until I am hoarse. I have done rain dances that probably would have gotten me laughed out of town if anyone had seen. I have checked the well 20 times a day as if that would somehow make more water appear. I do not know what else to do." "Then we will think of something together," Victoria said firmly. "Tomorrow, we will ride into town and talk to people. Someone must know something that could help. Maybe there is a spring we do not know about or a way to dig the well deeper or something we have not thought of." The next morning, they hitched up the wagon and made the long drive into Yuma. The town looked even more desperate than it had when Victoria had first arrived. Several businesses had closed, their windows boarded up, and the people moving through the streets had the hollow-eyed look of individuals pushed to their limits. They found Reverend Thompson in his church, sweeping the floor with slow, methodical movements. He looked up as they entered and smiled with genuine warmth, setting aside his broom to greet them. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, what a pleasant surprise. How are you managing?" "Not well," Caleb admitted bluntly. "Reverend, we need advice. Do you know of any water sources we might have missed? Any way to survive this drought that we have not considered?" The Reverend's smile faded, replaced by concern. "I wish I had better news for you, but most families are in the same situation. The Apache, however, might be able to help. There is a man named Gray Wolf who lives about 20 miles north of here, in the foothills. His people have survived in this land for generations, and they know things about finding water that we white folks never learned. He is known to be fair-minded and willing to trade knowledge for goods." Caleb exchanged a glance with Victoria. Relations between settlers and Apache were complicated and often hostile, shaped by years of broken treaties and violence on both sides. But these were desperate times, and desperate times called for taking risks. "You think he would be willing to help us?" Victoria asked. "I think it is worth trying," the Reverend said. "Gray Wolf has traded with some of the townspeople before, and he has always been honorable in his dealings. Take some supplies as a gesture of goodwill. Coffee, sugar, flour, things that are hard for his people to obtain. Show respect and humility, and he may share what he knows." They left the church with directions to Gray Wolf's camp and spent the rest of the day gathering supplies they could barely afford to give away. That evening they packed a wagon with sacks of flour and coffee, sugar and salt, a bolt of sturdy fabric and several blankets. It represented a significant portion of their remaining resources, but Caleb was adamant. "If this does not work, we will not need those supplies anyway," he said grimly. "We might as well take the chance." They set out the next morning in the pre-dawn darkness, hoping to avoid the worst of the day's heat. The journey north took them through terrain even more rugged than the land around their ranch, with rocky hills rising on either side of a narrow trail. Victoria found herself gripping the wagon seat as they jolted over stones and through dried creek beds, praying they would not break an axle or lose a wheel. It was mid-afternoon when they spotted smoke rising from a small canyon. Caleb guided the wagon toward it carefully, making no attempt to hide their approach. They rounded a bend and found themselves looking at a small Apache camp, perhaps 20 people in total, with traditional wickiups arranged in a loose circle around a central fire. Several men moved forward to intercept them, and Victoria felt her heart hammering against her ribs. These were not the noble savages of Eastern dime novels or the bloodthirsty raiders of newspaper accounts. They were simply people, thin and weathered like everyone else in this drought-stricken land, watching the newcomers with understandable wariness. An older man stepped forward, his long gray hair braided with strips of leather, and his weathered face marked with the lines of a hard life. He wore a mixture of traditional and white man's clothing, and his dark eyes missed nothing as they studied Caleb and Victoria. "I am Gray Wolf," he said in heavily accented but clear English. "Why do white settlers come to my camp?" Caleb climbed down from the wagon and helped Victoria down beside him, before turning to face Gray Wolf with his hat in his hands. "My name is Caleb Harrison, and this is my wife Victoria. We have a ranch southeast of Yuma, and we are dying of thirst just like everyone else in this cursed land. Reverend Thompson said you might be willing to share knowledge about finding water. We brought supplies to trade." Gray Wolf's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. He moved to the back of the wagon and examined the supplies they had brought, running his hands over the fabric and hefting the sacks of flour. After a long moment, he nodded. "You bring good trade goods, but knowledge of water is worth more than flour and coffee. What else can you offer?" Victoria stepped forward before Caleb could respond. "We have cattle on our land, or what is left of them. If you help us save our ranch, we will share our future prosperity with you. When the rains come and the grass grows again, we will give you 2 head of cattle every year for 10 years. We will put it in writing and have it witnessed by the Reverend. We will honor our word." Gray Wolf studied her for a long moment, and Victoria forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. She had no idea if she had just offered something culturally offensive or if her proposal made any sense from his perspective, but she was determined to show strength and sincerity. "You have brave wife," Gray Wolf said to Caleb. "That is good. Man alone is weak. Man with strong woman can survive anything." He turned back to Victoria. "I will help you, but not for cattle. You help my people also. The drought hurts everyone, white and Apache alike. You share knowledge of white man's ways that might help us, and I share Apache knowledge with you. Partnership, not trade." "Agreed." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected generosity. "Agreed. Thank you." Gray Wolf invited them to sit by the fire, and over cups of weak tea, he began to share knowledge that his people had accumulated over generations. He told them about signs in the landscape that indicated underground water, about certain plants that only grew where moisture was present below the surface. He drew diagrams in the dirt showing how to dig a well properly, angling it to follow the water table rather than simply going straight down. He explained how to collect and store every drop of dew, and how to purify water from questionable sources. But most importantly, He taught them about a specific type of rock formation that often marked the presence of a spring. "Look for red rock with white streaks, shaped like a sleeping coyote," he said. "Water flows beneath, sometimes shallow, sometimes deep, but always there. My grandfather found 3 such springs in his life. I have found 2. "Are there any near our land?" Caleb asked, barely daring to hope. Gray Wolf pulled out a piece of well-worn leather and began to sketch a crude map. "Here is Yuma. Here is Gila River. Your ranch, you say, is southeast." When Caleb nodded, Gray Wolf marked a spot and then added several other marks nearby. "There is Old Spring here, maybe 2 miles from where you describe your land. White settlers never found it because it is hidden in rocks and you must crawl to reach the water. But water is clean and sweet, and it flows even in worse droughts. My people used it for many generations before we were pushed from that land." Caleb stared at the map as if it were a holy relic. "You would tell us this, give us access to your people's water." "That water does not belong to my people or your people," Gray Wolf said quietly. "It belongs to the earth. The earth shares with everyone who approaches with respect. Besides, if you prosper, perhaps you treat my people more fairly than other white settlers. Perhaps you teach your children to see Apache as human beings, not animals. That is worth more than any water." They stayed until evening, learning everything Gray Wolf was willing to teach. Victoria found herself drawn to Gray Wolf's wife, a dignified woman named Morning Bird who showed her how to make simple medicines from desert plants and how to weave baskets from yucca fibers. The women worked side by side as they talked, and Victoria felt a connection forming that transcended language and culture. When they finally prepared to leave, laden with new knowledge and a rough map to the hidden spring, Gray Wolf walked them back to their wagon. He placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder and looked him in the eye. "You are good man, Caleb Harrison. You listen with respect and you value your wife's words. That is rare among white men. The spring I showed you will save your ranch, but remember what I said about partnership. Come back when you can, bring your wife, share your knowledge. Together, all people can survive better than alone." "We will," Caleb promised. "And the offer of cattle still stands whenever you need them." The ride back to their ranch seemed to take forever, even though they pushed the horses harder than was probably wise. They arrived after midnight, exhausted and dusty, but filled with a hope neither had felt in months. They collapsed into bed without even washing, too tired to do more than hold each other briefly before sleep claimed them. The next morning, they set out on horseback to search for the spring Gray Wolf had described. The map was rough, and the landmarks had to be interpreted carefully. But Caleb had lived on this land long enough to recognize most of the features Gray Wolf had marked. They rode through the early morning coolness, their eyes scanning the rocky outcroppings for anything that resembled a sleeping coyote. It was Victoria who spotted it, a formation of red sandstone with distinctive white quartz veins running through it that, from a certain angle, did indeed look like a reclining canine. She pointed it out to Caleb with a shout of excitement, and they urged their horses toward the rocks. The formation was larger than it had appeared from a distance, a jumble of boulders and slabs that created dozens of crevices and shadows. They dismounted and began to search on foot, crawling into openings and calling to each other as they eliminated possibilities. The sun climbed higher, and the heat began to build, but they refused to give up. It was Caleb who found the entrance to the spring, a narrow opening between 2 massive boulders that required him to lie flat and wriggle through like a snake. Victoria heard his shout of triumph from outside and felt her own cry of joy burst from her throat. They had found it. They had actually found it. Caleb emerged from the opening with his shirt soaked and his face split by the widest smile Victoria had ever seen on him. "It is real," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "There is a whole chamber in there and a pool of water that looks deep and clear. Victoria, we are saved. The ranch is saved." She threw herself into his arms, and he caught her and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he finally set her down, his eyes were bright with unshed tears, and she realized her own face was wet. "You are the rain my land has been waiting for," Caleb said softly, cupping her face in his hands. "You brought hope when I had none left. You brought new ideas and new possibilities. You brought life back to this place, Victoria. You are everything I needed without knowing I needed it." Victoria kissed him then, pouring all her love and relief and joy into the gesture. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, and the desire in Caleb's eyes made her pulse race. "We should probably figure out how to get water from that spring back to the ranch," she said, trying to sound practical. "Probably," Caleb agreed, but he was still looking at her in a way that made practical concerns seem very distant. "Or we could take a moment to celebrate first." They made love there in the shade of the red rocks, on a blanket spread over the hard ground, with a desperation and passion that surprised them both. This was different from their careful joinings in their marriage bed, raw and urgent and honest. Afterward they lay tangled together, sweaty and satisfied, and watched clouds drift across the brilliant sky. "You think those are rain clouds?" Victoria asked drowsily. "No," Caleb said, "but someday they will be, and when the rains come we will be ready for them." The work of developing the spring occupied the next several weeks. Caleb recruited help from Tom Peters and a few other ranchers, offering them access to the water in exchange for their labor. Together, they widened the entrance to the spring chamber and installed a hand pump that would allow them to draw water more easily. They dug a small reservoir near the ranch house and ran a pipe from the spring to keep it filled, creating a reliable water source for the first time in over a year. The change in the ranch was immediate and dramatic. The cattle, given regular access to clean water and supplemented with hay that Caleb could now afford to buy thanks to not losing his breeding stock, began to put on weight. The horses grew sleek and energetic. The garden, properly watered, exploded with life, producing vegetables that had Victoria canning and preserving for hours every day. Word of their discovery spread, and other ranchers came to ask for advice. Caleb shared what Gray Wolf had taught them freely, and several other families found water on their own land using the knowledge he passed along. The mood in Yuma began to shift from despair to cautious optimism. People were still suffering, but they were no longer helpless. True to their word, Caleb and Victoria made regular trips to Gray Wolf's camp, bringing supplies and sharing knowledge. Victoria taught Morning Bird to make bread using yeast and flour. While Morning Bird taught Victoria medicinal uses for plants Victoria had dismissed as worthless weeds. Caleb and Gray Wolf often rode together, ostensibly to hunt but really to talk, building a friendship that crossed cultural divides through mutual respect and shared hardship. As autumn deepened and the days grew slightly cooler, Victoria began to notice changes in her own body. She was tired more easily, her breasts were tender, and certain smells made her nauseous. She recognized the signs even before she missed her monthly courses, and the realization filled her with a complicated mix of joy and fear. She waited until she was certain before telling Caleb, choosing an evening when they sat together on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. He had his arm around her shoulders, and she was leaning into his solid warmth, feeling safe and cherished. "Caleb, I need to tell you something," she said quietly. He tensed slightly. "That sounds serious. Is something wrong?" "No, nothing is wrong. Quite the opposite, actually." She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. We are going to have a baby. I am about 2 months along, I think. Caleb went very still, and for a moment Victoria worried she had somehow miscalculated his reaction. Then he turned to her with a look of such pure wonder on his face that her fears evaporated instantly. A baby, he breathed. Victoria, are you certain? As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor. I have all the signs. He pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe, his face buried in her hair. When he finally released her enough to look at her face, she saw tears tracking through the dust on his cheeks. I never thought I would have this, he said, his voice rough with emotion. A wife I love, a ranch that is surviving, and now a child. It seems too much good fortune for one man to deserve. You deserve all of it, Victoria said firmly. You are a good man, Caleb Harrison, and you are going to be a wonderful father. They rode into Yuma the next day to see the doctor, who confirmed what Victoria already knew and pronounced her healthy and strong. He gave them advice about her diet and what activities to avoid and sent them home with instructions to return monthly for checkups. The pregnancy was not easy. The morning sickness lasted well into her 4th month, and the heat, even as it moderated with the approach of winter, left her exhausted. But Caleb was attentive to the point of being overbearing, insisting she rest more and work less, taking over tasks she had made her own. Victoria tolerated his hovering with good humor, understanding it came from love and fear of loss. As her belly swelled, she found herself thinking about her own mother and sisters back in Philadelphia. She had written to them regularly since arriving in Arizona, but her letters had been carefully edited accounts that omitted the hardships and emphasized the positive. Now, carrying her own child, she felt the weight of those omissions and sat down to write a more honest letter. She told her mother about the drought and the struggle to survive. She told her about gray wolf and mourning bird and the lessons she had learned about partnership and respect. She told her about Caleb, not as an idealized romantic figure, but as a real man with flaws and virtues, someone she had come to love deeply despite knowing him for such a short time. And she told her about the baby, about her hopes and fears for the future. The reply, when it came several weeks later, surprised her. Her mother wrote with uncharacteristic honesty about her own early marriage, about struggles Victoria had never known existed, about the strength required to build a life with another person. She wrote about her pride in Victoria's courage, and her regret that she had not prepared her daughter better for the realities of adult life. She enclosed a christening gown that had been worn by 3 generations of Ramsey babies, carefully wrapped and smelling faintly of lavender. Victoria wept over that letter, and when Caleb found her with tears streaming down her face, she handed it to him to read. He held her as he read, and when he finished, he kissed the top of her head. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," he said. "Perhaps someday we can visit them, or they can come here." "I would like that," Victoria said. "I would like them to see what we have built." Winter came to Arizona, which meant temperatures that were merely warm rather than scorching, and occasional cold nights that required blankets. The well continued to flow, fed by the hidden spring, and the ranch prospered. Caleb was able to buy more cattle, carefully selecting breeding stock that would rebuild his herd. He hired a young man named Danny to help with the heavier work, taking some of the burden off himself and ensuring Victoria did nothing that might endanger the baby. Christmas arrived with clear skies and moderate temperatures, and Victoria insisted on decorating the house with evergreen branches cut from the mountains and strings of dried berries. They invited Gray Wolf and his family to join them for a feast, along with Tom Peters and his wife. And the combination of cultures and traditions created a celebration, unlike anything any of them had experienced before. Gray Wolf brought a blessing for the unborn child, spoken in Apache, and then translated by his son, a young man named Swift Runner who had learned English at a mission school. Morning Bird brought a tiny pair of moccasins she had made, soft leather decorated with intricate beadwork, sized for a newborn. The gifts moved Victoria to tears, and she hugged Morning Bird tightly, knowing she had found a friend who would last a lifetime. As winter turned to spring, Victoria grew increasingly uncomfortable and eager to be done with pregnancy. Her back ached constantly, her ankles swelled, and she could no longer see her own feet. Caleb treated her like spun glass, which irritated her even as she appreciated his concern. "I am pregnant, not dying," she told him one morning when he tried to prevent her from gathering eggs. "Women have been doing this for thousands of years. I am perfectly capable of collecting eggs from the henhouse." "I know," he said, "but humor me anyway. I cannot stand the thought of anything happening to you or the baby." His vulnerability touched her, and she softened. "Nothing is going to happen to either of us. I am strong, and this baby is strong. In a few weeks, you will be holding your son or daughter, and all this worry will seem silly." The baby arrived on a warm evening in late April, after 12 hours of hard labor that left Victoria exhausted but triumphant. Morning Bird attended the birth alongside the doctor from town, and her calm presence and knowledge of traditional methods made the experience far less frightening than it might have been. Caleb paced the porch outside like a caged animal, until Morning Bird finally took pity on him and allowed him into the room to hold Victoria's hand during the final pushes. Their son entered the world with a lusty cry that spoke of strong lungs and a fierce will to live. The doctor cleaned him and wrapped him in a blanket before placing him in Victoria's arms, and she looked down at the red, wrinkled face and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. "He is perfect," she whispered. "He is beautiful," Caleb agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like his mother." They named him Robert Thomas Harrison after both their fathers, but quickly took to calling him Robbie. He was a healthy baby with his father's strong features and his mother's dark eyes, and he seemed to thrive on the attention lavished upon him by everyone who visited the ranch. The spring of 1879 brought change to Arizona territory beyond the walls of the Harrison household. Rain came at last, not the deluge Victoria had imagined in her most optimistic dreams, but steady, soaking storms that turned the brown landscape green almost overnight. The Gila River began to flow again, and the grass grew tall enough to wave in the breeze. Wildflowers bloomed across the desert, painting the land in shades of purple and yellow and red, and the air smelled of growth and possibility. Caleb's cattle prospered on the abundant grass, and he was able to sell some of his steers at prices that allowed him to begin repaying the debts he had accumulated during the drought. The ranch, so close to failure just months before, was now thriving. Other ranchers who had survived the drought began to rebuild as well, and the mood in Yuma shifted from desperation to celebration. In June, true to his word, Caleb selected 2 prime heifers and drove them to Gray Wolf's camp as payment for the knowledge that had saved their ranch. Gray Wolf accepted the cattle with dignity, but insisted on reciprocating with gifts of his own, beautiful blankets woven by the women of his tribe, and a carved cradle for Robbie that was a work of art. "You are good friend," Gray Wolf told Caleb as they sat together and smoked. "You honor your word and treat my people with respect. That is rare among white men." "You saved my family and my land," Caleb replied. "I could give you cattle for the rest of my life, and it would not be payment enough for that." As summer arrived and the temperatures climbed once again, Victoria found herself reflecting on the year that had passed since her arrival in Arizona. She had come west as a desperate woman fleeing a failed life, with no real hope beyond survival. She had found instead a home, a partner, a purpose, and a love deeper than anything she had imagined possible. One evening, as she rocked Robbie to sleep and watched Caleb mending harness by lamplight, she felt a profound sense of contentment settle over her. This life was not easy, and she had no illusions that their struggles were over. But they were facing those struggles together, stronger as a unit than they could ever have been alone. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, looking up from his work and catching her watching him. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Victoria said honestly. "A year ago, I was terrified and alone with no idea what I was walking into. Now I have everything I ever wanted without knowing I wanted it." Caleb set aside the harness and came to sit beside her, placing his hand on Robbie's tiny back. "I am the lucky one. You brought life back to this place, Victoria. You brought water and hope and love. You made me remember what it means to be human instead of just surviving." "We did that for each other," Victoria said softly. "That is what partnership means." The years that followed brought their share of challenges and triumphs. Another son, James Matthew Harrison, arrived in the spring of 1881, a calmer baby than his older brother but just as healthy and strong. A daughter, Sarah Catherine Harrison, followed in 1883, and she had her father's eyes and her mother's determination from the moment she entered the world. The ranch continued to prosper, expanding as Caleb was able to purchase additional land from families leaving the territory. The drought remained a memory, though Caleb never took water for granted again. Maintaining and improving the spring system Gray Wolf had helped them find. The relationship between the Harrison family and Gray Wolf's people deepened over time. Robbie and his siblings grew up playing with Apache children, learning both cultures and speaking both languages. When Swift Runner married, Caleb and Victoria attended the ceremony, and when the Harrisons celebrated the christening of each new baby, Gray Wolf and Morning Bird were among the honored guests. The territory changed around them, becoming more settled and civilized with each passing year. The railroad came to Yuma in 1882, bringing new opportunities for trade and travel. Victoria's family visited in the summer of 1884, her parents and two sisters making the long journey west to meet their grandchildren and nieces. Her mother's tears at seeing Victoria's home and understanding the life she had built were as healing as any rain. Through it all, the love between Caleb and Victoria deepened and matured, growing from the desperate bargain of two strangers into something solid and enduring. They learned each other's rhythms and moods, learned to communicate in glances and touches as much as words, learned to be partners in the truest sense. On their 10th wedding anniversary, in June of 1888, Caleb surprised Victoria with a trip to San Diego, leaving the children in the care of Morning Bird and her daughters. They spent 3 days by the ocean, marveling at the endless water after years in the desert, walking on the beach and talking about their dreams for the future. "You ever regret it?" Caleb asked one evening as they watched the sun set over the Pacific. Giving up your life back east to come to Arizona, Victoria did not even have to think about her answer. "Never, not once. That was not really a life, Caleb. It was an existence, waiting for something real to happen. This is real. You are real. Our children, our home, our partnership, all of it is more real than anything I experienced in those first 23 years. I love you," Caleb said simply, "more than I have words to express." "I know," Victoria said, leaning into his embrace. "I love you too. You are the rain my life was waiting for." They returned to Arizona refreshed and ready to face whatever challenges came next. The ranch continued to thrive, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. Their children grew strong and healthy, educated both in the local school and at home, learning to ride and shoot and work cattle, but also to read and cipher and think for themselves. Victoria never forgot the desperation of those early months, the fear and uncertainty and bone-deep exhaustion. She kept a journal, recording the story of their survival and their partnership, hoping that someday her grandchildren would read it and understand the foundation upon which their prosperity was built. In 1895, when Arizona Territory was still 2 decades from statehood, Caleb and Victoria celebrated their 17th anniversary surrounded by their 5 children, for 2 more daughters had joined the family in the intervening years. Gray Wolf and Morning Bird were there as well, older now but still vital, still dear friends. Tom Peters and his wife attended, along with Reverend Thompson and dozens of other families who had become their community. As Victoria looked around at the gathering, at the house Caleb had expanded to accommodate their growing family, at the green pastures filled with healthy cattle, at the children running and playing without regard to whether their skin was white or brown, she felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with material success. They had built something here in this harsh land, something worth having. Not just a ranch or a business, but a family, a community, a bridge between cultures that had so often been at war. They had taken desperate circumstances and transformed them into something beautiful through partnership, respect, and love. That evening, after the guests had departed and the children were finally asleep, Victoria and Caleb sat on their porch as they had so many evenings before. The stars blazed overhead with that particular brightness only found in the desert, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled at the moon. "You remember the first night we sat here together?" Caleb asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Of course. I was terrified and pretending not to be, and you were trying so hard to be kind to a stranger." "You were never really a stranger," Caleb said thoughtfully. "From the moment I saw you step off that stagecoach, dusty and determined, I knew you were someone special. I knew you were exactly what I needed, even if I could not have articulated why." "That is very poetic for a cowboy," Victoria teased. "You bring out the poet in me," Caleb replied with a smile. "Among other things." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds and enjoying the cool breeze that made Arizona evenings so pleasant after the heat of the day. In the distance, they could hear the windmill turning, a sound that never failed to comfort them with its promise of water, of life, of continuity. "I want you to know something," Victoria said finally. "Everything I have become, everything I am, is because you believed in me. You gave me the space to be strong and the support to be vulnerable. You made me a partner instead of just a wife. You loved me not despite my independence but because of it. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." Caleb turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "And you brought me back to life. I was dying in all the ways that matter when you arrived, dried up and bitter and alone. You were the rain, Victoria. You were the water that brought everything back to life. Not just the land, but me. My heart, my hope, my ability to imagine a future worth living." They kissed then, a long, slow kiss that held 17 years of partnership and passion, of struggles overcome and victories celebrated together. When they finally parted, both were smiling. "We should go to bed," Victoria said practically. "Tomorrow is going to be another long day." "Tomorrow is always another long day," Caleb agreed, standing and pulling her up beside him. "But we will face it together, like we have faced everything else." They walked inside hand in hand, closing the door on the Arizona night and all its wild beauty. Inside, Their house was full of sleeping children and the accumulated treasures of 17 years of marriage, each item holding a memory, a story, a piece of the life they had built together. As Victoria settled into bed beside her husband, his arm coming around her automatically in sleep, she thought about the frightened young woman who had stepped off the stage coach so long ago. That woman would barely recognize the person Victoria had become, confident and capable and deeply, profoundly happy. She had traveled west searching for escape, for a fresh start, for anything that was not the failed life she was leaving behind. What she had found instead was everything she had not known she needed. A love story written in drought and rain, in partnership and persistence, in the gradual transformation of two lonely people into a family, a community, a legacy. The drought had tested them and shaped them, but it had also brought them together and forced them to become more than they had been. In seeking to survive, they had learned to thrive. In facing hardship together, they had discovered strength they had not known they possessed. And in opening their hearts to love, they had found the water that truly mattered, the rain that fell not from the sky but from the human capacity for connection and compassion. Victoria closed her eyes and let sleep claim her, secure in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it as they had faced everything else. Together, as partners, as lovers, as two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed to become who they were meant to be. The years continued to roll by, each bringing its own joys and sorrows, challenges and triumphs. Their eldest son Robbie grew into a fine young man, taking over more and more of the ranch operations as Caleb's hair turned gray and his movements grew slightly slower. James followed in his brother's footsteps, while Sarah surprised everyone by showing a talent for mathematics and eventually becoming a teacher in Yuma. The younger daughters, Emma and Grace, grew into young women with their own dreams and ambitions, shaped by parents who had taught them that women could be strong and independent while still being loving and connected. They watched their mother run the household accounts, make business decisions alongside their father, and command respect from everyone who knew her, and they grew up believing they could do anything. Gray Wolf passed away peacefully in 1902, surrounded by his family and friends, both Apache and white. Caleb and Victoria were among those who mourned him, and they ensured that the annual gift of cattle to his people continued, now managed by Swift Runner and his family. Morning Bird lived another 6 years, and when she died in 1908, Victoria wept as if she had lost her own mother. But there were joys too, so many joys. Grandchildren arrived, the next generation to carry on the Harrison legacy. Robbie married a rancher's daughter from Texas, and James fell in love with a woman from California. Sarah married a fellow teacher, and together they established a school that welcomed both white and Apache children. Emma and Grace both found partners who understood and appreciated their independent spirits. Caleb and Victoria grew old together, their hands becoming gnarled with arthritis, their hair turning white, their movements slowing with the years. But they never lost the connection that had been forged in those desperate early days, the partnership that had saved them both. On a warm evening in May of 1913, 35 years after Victoria had first arrived in Yuma, they sat together on their porch and watched the sun set over land that was still green and thriving. The well continued to flow, fed by the spring gray wolf had helped them find so long ago, and the cattle grazing in the distance were descendants of those first desperate survivors. "Caleb," Victoria said softly, taking his weathered hand in hers, "I want you to know that I would do it all again. Every hard moment, every struggle, every tear, I would do it all again to have this life with you." Caleb squeezed her hand gently, his eyes on the blazing colors of the sunset. "I know, my love, and so would I. You were the rain my land was waiting for, but more than that, you were the rain my soul needed. You made everything bloom again." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of family, of grandchildren playing and children laughing, of life continuing in all its beautiful chaos. Outside, the land stretched away in all directions, green and vital, marked by the work of their hands and the sweat of their brows. This was their legacy, Victoria thought with deep satisfaction. Not just the ranch or the cattle or the material success, but the love they had built, the family they had raised, the bridges they had constructed between cultures, the partnership they had maintained through everything life had thrown at them. They had taken a desperate bargain made in the midst of drought and transformed it into something beautiful and enduring. "I love you," she said simply, the words as true and necessary as breathing. "I love you too," Caleb replied, and his voice held the weight of 35 years of shared life, of joys and sorrows, of struggles overcome and victories celebrated together. They rose eventually and went inside, moving slowly but moving together, as they had always done and always would do. Behind them, the Arizona night settled over the land like a benediction, the stars blazing overhead, the windmill turning steadily, the spring flowing hidden among the rocks, a promise kept and a legacy secured. The years of struggle had passed, the drought was distant memory, and the rains had come and gone with the seasons as they always would. But the love between Caleb and Victoria Harrison remained constant, a wellspring that never ran dry, nourishing everything it touched and ensuring that life would continue to bloom in this beautiful, harsh, unforgiving, generous land they called home. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not the size of their ranch or the number of their cattle or the wealth they had accumulated, but the fact that they had faced life together, as partners and lovers and friends, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed to become whole. They had survived drought and hardship, raised children and built community, and through it all, they had loved each other with a constancy that was itself a kind of miracle. As Victoria drifted off to sleep that night, Caleb's arm around her as it had been for 35 years, she smiled with the deep contentment of a life well lived. She had come west as a mail-order bride during a drought, uncertain and afraid, and she had found more than she had ever dared to dream. She had found home, purpose, family, and love, all bound up in the complicated, beautiful, enduring partnership she shared with the cowboy who had looked at her that first day and seen not just a mail-order bride, but the rain his land had been waiting for. And in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of a life built together through determination, partnership, and love, Victoria Ramsey Harrison closed her eyes and rested, knowing that their story was complete, their legacy secure, their love eternal.